Hi everyone! So, you might remember that at the start of Season 10, there was one thing every fan of Death Battle was talking about: the Cipher Wheel. Appearing in the trailer that heralded the start of the season, this cryptic puzzle set the community on fire with speculation, both in terms of decoding the text and assigning meaning to the symbols in the wheel. It was a fun time to be in the community, getting to watch others endlessly discuss what episodes could correlate to what the Cipher put forth. That naturally led to some creating videos on the topic, often presenting their own ideas of what the season would look like based on their interpretations of the Cipher. With the release of Martian Manhunter vs. Silver Surfer drawing near as of writing this, we're almost at the halfway mark for Season 10, and what a season it's been so far. We've had some instant classics from the Death Battle team so far this year, and I can't wait to see what they bring to the table in the second half. But that's all for another video at a later date. If you're a fan of Biff's content, which you probably are if you're subscribed to me, you probably know that he tends to make mid-season ranking videos at around this point in the season. I considered doing something similar at first, but then it occurred to me. Since I wasn't making videos around the time the Cipher first dropped, why not make a video on it now with over half of the season known to us? So that's what I'm doing here. This video is going to be a relaxed look back at the Season 10 Cipher, ascribing episodes we've gotten and know about at this point to symbols on the wheel, and filling out the rest based on what I think are most likely episodes to happen based on what's left. Or at least what I'd like the lineup to look like. Leave a comment on what you think of my Cipher prediction at the end. I'd love to generate some more discussion now that we're halfway through the season. With that, let's get into it. Okay, at this point I'm going to be mostly unscripted. Let's start by filling out the Cipher wheel with the episodes we know are happening or have happened, going clockwise from the top. Okay, so first on the list going clockwise from the top is the question mark, which we've basically all agreed and known from the beginning is Bill versus Discord. There's really nothing else that it could be, and like with it coming up so soon, I think it's pretty safe to ascribe that value to it. I don't think that's ever really been a point of contention with Cipher discussions, so yeah, we're just gonna go with that. Next is the $, which I gotta be honest was giving me some trouble when I was first thinking about making this, because I really had no idea what it could ascribe, what it could mean, or what it could relate to. But after talking about it with my friends a little bit and thinking about it some more, I think that this is actually relating to Killua versus Misaka. Like, the connections to this aren't quite as, like, iron tight as others might be, but I don't think that there's necessarily going to be like a solid through line of how relating these are to the matchups. Like, I think that they specifically made quite a few of these, at the very least, very vague in order to keep people guessing and to keep them from just guessing it immediately, outside of the ones that, like, we already knew about for the most part. And so the reason I think that the $sign pertains to Killua Misaka is mainly for two reasons. The first being that the Zoldycks, which are Killua's family, are like super assassins, but if I recall correctly, were stated in the analysis to be super rich. I definitely remember that, like, they mentioned that photos of them sell for millions, so that's at least what I remember off the top of my head. I'm pretty sure they were described as being super rich. And then the connection with Misaka, obviously, is that she uses currency. They're like arcade coins, but like still coins, currency. They have like some sort of value. She uses those as her main projectiles to attack with her railgun attack. So yeah, I think it's pretty solid that the $sign is what fits Killua Misaka, at least compared to everything else on this list, because outside of the awesome funny Beaker, I couldn't really think of anything else that would suit this. So yeah, we're gonna go with that. So next up we get to the Skull and Crossbones, which I remember from early interpretations of the Cipher, a lot of people were thinking that this could be like a poison-based matchup, like something with Reptile from Mortal Kombat. A lot of people were also speculating it could be like skeletons or pirate-themed, like specifically Spinal versus Cervantes. A lot of people were saying that that could be it, which I would have absolutely been down to see. I really like that matchup. But I think, based on what we've seen and what we have at this point, I think that this is most likely pertaining to Guts versus Dimitri. This isn't like a super in-depth reason or anything. It's pretty much solely because, like, they're both, like, killers of many people. Like, the main connection between them is that they're, like, driven crazy to, like, violent, vengeful paths in their lives because of the trauma they endured. And so I think, at least compared to like everything else on the wheel, I couldn't really think of anything else that would suit these two the same way, at least like in a unified sense, like something that would apply to both of them. Like, I've seen some people say that this is like the crossing swords, but like, I don't see how that is at all the case when Dimitri is most known as a user of lances and spears. Like, obviously he can use swords in Fire Emblem, it's a video game, you can basically make him into whatever you want him to be, but the main thing between them is not their weapons, it's like their paths and like the kind of characters they are. So I think, at least out of everything else here, that the Skull and Crossbones suits Guts vs. Dimitri the best. Next up is going to be the star symbol here. Now, I think most people were saying that this was probably a JoJo matchup, like the Joestar family birthmark. But based on the episodes that we've gotten at this point, I think that this is not actually the birthmark for the Joestar bloodline. I think that this is just like a star in space. And so, out of what we have so far, I've decided to give this one to Stitch versus Rocket. It could be interchangeable with the Wave, because I have that labeled as Martian Manhunter versus Silver Surfer. You could reasonably switch these between the star and the Wave symbols without, like, much changing in terms of my predictions for this, because both the star and the Wave could connect to both Stitch versus Rocket and Manhunter versus Surfer in different ways. As far as Stitch Rocket goes, you know, there's the scene where Stitch is surfing on the wing of the Milano, going towards Rocket after the explosion goes off, so you could easily say that that's the surfing part of the Wave. And also the whole episode kind of has like a beach vibe going on, even with the background of the thumbnail. So I think it's very reasonable to say that it could be the Wave, but I've given it to Stitch Rocket for reasons that I'll get into when I actually talk about the Wave symbol on its own and why I gave that to Manhunter vs. Surfer instead of the other way around, so just stick around for that. Moving right on down, we get to the Recycle symbol. Now, I think this was throwing a lot of people off when initial speculation was happening. Like, a lot of people thought that it meant like, oh, they're gonna recycle old characters, so it's gonna be like a rematch with old characters, but there's been a lot of those this season with returning combatants, like there were 3 in a row at one point, so I definitely don't think it has anything to do with that anymore. So what else could the Recycle symbol apply to out of what we know of so far? Well, I think that this is actually best suited for Phoenix versus Raven out of all the options. Because, you know, people, I think, focus too much on the recycle part of it rather than what I think should have been focused on, which is just the cycle aspect. Because, you know, you have, like, the Phoenix's cycle of life and death, constantly being reborn in its own ashes, so that there's that obvious connection to Jean Grey. And then also how it ties into Raven is, like, she's constantly having to keep her emotions in check, so it's kind of like a cycle of, like, a neutral state, and then getting to an angrier state where she becomes, like, Dark Raven, and going back to normal after, like, the Titans bring her down. And also, I believe that Trigon goes through some kind of reincarnation or, like, rebirth sort of thing, because I remember in the aftermath of the episode, I was confused about, like, how Dark Raven would have been brought into account if Raven had trumped Trigon in the past, and I was told that, like, Trigon gets reborn, he, like, comes back even after his soul gets nuked. So, I think it's a little bit more of a stretch than, like, Phoenix's angle, but I think it's certainly more applicable than putting this in the Pentagram spot. Because, like, outside of, like, Demon Fire, I guess that's what people go with for that, in terms of connecting it to Phoenix, but I don't see that being the case at all. I think the Recycle symbol is a much better pick for this one. Now we're going to come down to this, like, half and half circle, where it's, like, half light, half colored in, and I think I've come to the conclusion out of what we know about in the episodes we have. I think that this is best suited for Cole versus Alex. Like, I've seen lots of people put it in, like, the Scales of Judgment spot, which makes a lot of sense, because, like, one of the biggest connections between the Infamous and Prototype games is, like, the morality system, where, like, you get different powers and, like, different skill trees depending on, like, the moral weight of your actions in the games. But I think that, respective to the games themselves, I think that the half and half circle could also represent, like, that divide between good and evil moralities in the games. Because, like, the scales of judgment, I think, kind of indicate more of an ambiguity or, like, a gray area. At least I kind of usually associate them with being able to include something like that. Whereas, like, the morality systems in Infamous and Prototype tend to be very black and white. Like, it's very binary. Either an action you do is good or an action you do is evil. And, like, you get points toward those respective trees depending on which one you go with. So just going off of that, I'm very comfortable putting Cole versus Alex in this spot. Both because I think that it's a suitable pick for it, and because I just kind of wanted to free up the scales of judgment for a match that I would put in there later, so you'll see what I mean by that later, but yeah, I think the half and half circle is a fair enough pick for Cole versus Alex on this wheel. Next is the Taijitu symbol, or as most people would probably call it, the yin-yang symbol. I think this one is fairly open and shut as far as what it could apply to. I mean, Nemesis literally applied this to his episode before the season was even out. It's Darth Vader versus Obito. Now, I've also seen some people throwing around the idea that this could also apply to Cole versus Alex, but for similar reasons that I decided to not put it on the scales of judgment, that being, like, the morality systems that tie them together being not nearly as ambiguous or nuanced in terms of, like, how they affect the gameplay. I think that the yin-yang symbol also has, like, some aspect of grayness, or, like, light and dark being inherently intertwined, which I think sets it apart from the more rigid morality systems of Infamous and Prototype. Meanwhile, I think it's very applicable to Darth Vader and Obito, because there's the obvious dichotomy between, like, the light and dark sides of the Force and, like, the ninja establishment, pretty much. But then there's also the fact that, like, the reason that both of them turned to, like, the side of evil, initially at least, was because both of them had, like, a goal that they wanted to uphold and that they thought was noble enough to pursue. Like, Vader wanted to save Padme by joining forces with Palpatine, and then Obito wanted to create the kind of world where everyone could work together and live in harmony by joining with Madara's Giga Plan. And it's also that level of nuance that makes me want to go with this symbol for Vader Obito than the other ones, like the half and half circle or the scales of judgment. It's like Vader and Obito's connections have very little to do with, like, legality or, like, being judged for their actions. And then, like, the half and half circle, like I said, I think there's less nuance to be had with that symbol, at least with how I interpret it relative to Cole versus Alex. So yeah, I'm very comfortable going with Vader Obito for the Taijitu. Next, we jump up to the crossing swords, which I think most people, from what I've seen anyway, are pretty much in consensus about this one. This one is pretty obviously meant to be representing Chosen Undead versus Dragonborn, or Skyrim versus Dark Souls. It's not, like, super nuanced, at least compared to other ones on this Cipher wheel. It's basically just, like, the idea of, like, oh, these two sort of knightly figures, and, like, they both primarily use swords, or, like, they're most well known for using swords out of their many different weapons. So it makes sense to have, like, them crossing swords like this, especially since, like, Fireborn, the track for the episode, makes reference to their swords a couple of times. I think in the chorus it does. That's where it does it mainly, anyway. And so I think the heightened attention to swords relative to this matchup is good enough reason to go with this symbol anyway, regardless of, like, how much someone could rationalize it to fit anything else on here. Next on the wheel is the Atom Rings, which, I mean, this one was pretty plainly obvious from the beginning. It's just Ant-Man versus Atom. Like, I don't think I really need to go into much depth as to why I think this goes here. I don't think anyone else has put forth a compelling argument for why it would go anywhere else. At least outside of Biffweed with the Beaker, but that's mainly just for the bit, so yeah, we're just gonna slap the greatest episode ever made here. And last but not least, in terms of the episodes that we know about already, we come to the Wave. And like I said before, I'm putting Martian Manhunter vs. Silver Surfer in this one. Now, the main reason I went with the Wave for this episode, in comparison to, like, the Star instead, would mainly be because the cutaway gag for Silver Surfer and the end cutaway both are very dependent on the Silver Surfer being a surfer, with, like, Boomstick having the surfboard and the god-awful sunburn, suntan. Like, it doesn't really have as much to do with Martian Manhunter, if anything. Like, nothing comes to mind off the top of my head that would tie to him anyway, but, like, I'm more comfortable putting this one here, mainly because of where I wanted to put the other episode that could fit this wave, at least out of what we know so far, that being Stitch Rocket. And the main reason for that is because Stitch Rocket really had 3 possibilities for what it could tie into on this Cipher wheel, and those 3 would be the Wave, the Star, and the Beaker. But out of, like, the 3 things that would tie Stitch vs. Rocket to those symbols, that being, like, the beach vibe, the space theme, or, like, the scientific experiment theme, I believe the episode most consistently plays into, like, the space angle of the matchup. Like, it's what they talk about when they lead into it in the introduction, and, like, they talk a lot about how they're from outer space and all that sort of thing. Like, the scientific experiment angle kind of takes more of a background theme, comparatively, I would say. And then as far as the beach vibe goes, that's mainly just restricted to, like, the thumbnail and the setting being in Space Hawaii. And, like, that scene with the tidal wave, which I would say does not fit the wave as neatly as one of the characters' whole thing being, like, based off surfers and surfer culture. So I'm more comfortable putting Stitch vs. Rocket in the Star spot because of what I just outlined. And so that really only leaves the Wave for Manhunter vs. Surfer being symbols on the wheel that would really suit it. So that's where I've decided to put it, at least for now. I could see this flipping around if someone puts a decent argument for why it would go somewhere else, but I don't really know where else it would go. So yeah, for now, it goes here. It stays. And that's going to cap off all of the episodes that we've either gotten or know are coming at this point, which, as far as the latter goes, is pretty much just Cole versus Alex at this point, so I don't know where I was going with that tangent, but anyway, now that we've got those labeled with where I think they go on the wheel, we're going to move on to the spots on the wheel that don't have an episode corresponding to them yet, that we know of. And I'm going to fill in what I think either fits that spot, or what I would like to fit that spot, so yeah, let's get into that now. So the first new symbol on the Cipher that we're going to address is this kind of Lotus-y symbol. It's a little hard to make out what exactly it's supposed to be, especially with how, like, minimalistic a lot of the symbol designs on the Cipher wheel tend to be. But I'm fairly confident in my choice for this symbol, and I think it fits for this season as well, so I'm going to say that this symbol represents Anne versus Luz. Now, I've seen this matchup put in this spot by a couple of other people, just from the couple of other Cipher predictions that I've glanced at before making this video. And the general consensus around it seems to mainly, at least from what I've seen, which, again, is not that much, a lot of people seem to focus on, like, the symbolism of what the Lotus represents, like, spiritually, which tends to be, like, strength and rebirth, and they kind of tie those into Anne and Luz's journeys throughout their shows, but, like, I don't think that's super unique for this matchup. Like, you can apply those sort of themes to, like, any protagonist versus protagonist matchup, and it'd fit basically the same way it does for Anne versus Luz, so I don't really know if that's enough to justify putting it here on its own, but thankfully, I have a couple of other reasons that admittedly are a lot simpler for why I think it fits here. So the first thing to consider out of the 2 points that I really have is that if we are going to assume that the symbol here, like the outlining portions, are the petals of a lotus flower, which I think is a fair assumption to make considering the shape of the petals. Like, just from a glance, a lotus seems pretty similar to it. Lotuses do tend to grow in like damper, more water-filled areas, including floodplains, swamps, and marshes. So that fits in really nicely with the setting of Amphibia. So that could tie into Anne's half of the matchup really nicely. But then how does that equate to Luz at all? Well, it's hard to see, especially with like how pixelated the image gets when you zoom in a lot. But on the very interior of like the Lotus shape, there is a small symbol drawn on the inside of it. And after looking at it really closely, I've kind of come to the conclusion that this looks very similar to the ice glyph that Luz learns to use in the Owl House. Now again, the pixelation of the image and the blood on the background that kind of makes it red, both of those things make it a little difficult to tell if that's exactly what that symbol is. Like, it's very small. It could really be anything. It could mean nothing. I could be completely fucking talking out of my ass here. But I really hope that, like, this is just meant to be very blatantly Anne versus Luz, because I think that this match needs to happen this season if it wants to have a chance at performing really well. Because, like, at least relative to if it were to happen next season, like, that would be taking place quite a while after there will be no more Amphibia or Owl House media, considering both shows have ended and Disney has basically told both of them to fuck off. And if Death Battle waits too long to do it after there's been no media coming out for either series and a lot of the momentum behind the matchup kind of goes away, then they could very easily have another Steven versus Star on their hands where they kind of waited too long to do it and it ends up not doing super great in terms of views. So I think this season would be the perfect time to do it, especially since they had their Death Battle cast about it, like, over the winter break between seasons 9 and 10. So I think that this season would be the optimal time to do Anne versus Luz, and if it ends up being tied to this symbol on the Cipher, I will be both vindicated that I was right about it here, and also very happy that the match is happening. Next, we move on to the Scales of Judgment, which I mentioned a bunch earlier with a lot of the matches that could tie into it, but I wanted to set them aside for different symbols, mainly because I had a match that I really wanted to put here. Now, I've seen a lot of people say that this could, or not even could, I've seen a lot of people basically thinking that this is guaranteed to be like a Judge Dredd episode, like Judge Dredd versus the Punisher or something like that. But I'm not sure if that's going to be the case, because I get the feeling that Death Battle kind of front-loaded a lot of their comic book matchups in like the first half of the season. Like 4 out of the 8 episodes at the start of the season in the first half have had a Marvel character in them, and 3 of those have been Marvel versus DC, so this might be me putting too much faith in Death Battle's, like, willingness to completely overload their seasons with comic book matchups, but I personally hope that there's not really any of those left in the season. I would be completely fine with circumventing both Marvel and DC in terms of not giving them any more matchups for this season. I think they've had quite a few solid ones, more than enough to sustain the comic book fans for one season. So then, what do I think or want to be in place of them here? Well, it's pretty simple. I just want this to be Sans versus the Judge from Off. It did pretty well in the Champions Ballot last year, at least to my recollection, and I would really enjoy this one happening. This is definitely my favorite Undertale matchup, and I think it would be really cool to see Off on the show, even though I don't know that much about it. Mainly, the reason I'm going with this one is because, like I said, I want there to be an Undertale matchup sooner rather than later, and I gotta be honest, I'm not a big fan of Frisk versus Ness. Like, if we're talking about Pacifist Root Frisk, then, like, the whole point of Pacifist Root is that Frisk avoids fighting as much as possible. Like, the only point that they really have to fight is against Asgore at the end. And, like, that just doesn't really suit a death battle, in my opinion. Because, like, if you turn to the neutral or genocide routes to give Frisk, like, weapons and feats and stuff, that's really not even Frisk anymore at that point. That's just Kara. That's, like, an entirely different character. So why would you not just title it, like, Kara versus Ness? Well, it's pretty simple. It's because Kara versus Ness probably wouldn't get as many views as Frisk versus Ness, now would it? And really, like, if you restrict Frisk to the pacifist route, they really don't have any attack power feats at all. They'd really just have, like, durability from being able to tank Azrael's attacks. And, like, at that point, you're basically just feeding Frisk to Ness. Like, it's really apparent to anyone who knows anything about Earthbound stats that Ness probably beats Frisk, especially if they're just using pacifist stuff. And I don't see how even they could use, like, stuff from other routes without, like, just having Kara take over Frisk at some point, which I would not really care to see. So yeah, this kind of turned into more of a rant against Frisk versus Ness than me talking up Sans versus the Judge. But ultimately, I think that Sans versus the Judge would just be really cool to happen here, especially since it's easily my preferred Undertale match over the other really popular options, so I decided to just put it here for the heck of it. Why not? And, like, in terms of performance, I'm sure that Off would not do nearly as well as Earthbound, even though I would posit that Earthbound is far from widely recognized outside of, like, representation in Smash, because it hasn't really gotten any attention in quite a while. But I would argue that Sans would be able to carry an episode even more easily than Frisk would, because not everyone would really know Frisk's name. Like, they'd probably be able to recognize them as the main character of Undertale, but they wouldn't recognize, like, Frisk as a character, at least not everybody would. But meanwhile, everybody and their fucking grandma knows who Sans is. I can't think of a single person who would not click on a Death Battle video if it had fucking Sans Undertale in the thumbnail. Tell me that shit would not do views. You cannot convince me otherwise. So yeah, this segment kind of turned into more of a rant than I was expecting it to be, but yeah, I just put Sans versus Judge here because I want it to happen, and I think it's at least somewhat likely. Like, I could see it happening, especially if the Death Battle crew puts their faith in Sans to be able to carry the episode in terms of views. But hey, if this Undertale matchup has too obscure of an opponent to really make it worth the Death Battle team's time, I'm still not on board with Frisk versus Ness instead of this one. Give me Giovanni Potage versus Papyrus instead of that any fucking day. And from this one, we move on to the suit. Now, I've seen people thinking that this could be Spy versus 47, could be another, like, it's Secret Agent or, like, another Assassin episode, kind of like Bond versus Wick was. And, like, I would be very excited to see another match like that. We very rarely get a match with tones like those ones have, or had in the case of Bond versus Wick. But I'm leaning more towards something else being in this spot, because I think that this has less to do with, like, putting up more of a formal front, at least in terms of the symbolism of the image in the Cipher, and more to do with, like, an everyman front. Like, if that makes any sense, like, putting up more of a normal image to conceal the person you are underneath. And I think there's no better matchup for Death Battle to do at this point that kind of embodies that idea more than Kira versus Adachi. Because, you know, I kind of went on, like, a similar tangent of explaining why this sort of fits that theme when I talked about this matchup in my Top 10 Most Wanted Episodes video. So you can go watch that segment of it if you want, like, a more detailed breakdown of, like, just that matchup in general, I guess. But I think that it suits that idea really well because, like I said, both Kira and Adachi sort of put up those everyman, like, personas, no pun intended, to keep, like, the respective investigation teams that are pursuing them for their serial killings off of their tracks. And I think that this would be a great way to implement a JoJo matchup into the Cipher wheel without banking on the star being the Joestar family bloodline birthmark. What's more is that I think that this matchup is pretty likely to happen sooner rather than later. I don't really have a lot of reasons for saying that, but, like, I know that, if I remember correctly, I've heard Liam express support for this matchup on Death Battle Cast before. And it would be very unique compared to the JoJo matchups they've had on the show before. Like, they've only had two proper stand users between Jotaro and Dio, and then the other one's Jonathan, who just uses Hamon. He doesn't really have a stand. So it would be really cool to see Kira and Killer Queen, because, like, Killer Queen's bomb transmutation is very different in application compared to, like, Star Platinum and the World's, like, Time Stop. And it's very different, like, stat-wise, too, so in a straight-up brawl between, like, Killer Queen and Magatsu Izanagi, it would play out very differently compared to, like, the Ora Atatatata clash between Jotaro and Kenshiro. And also, it's been, like, I think 4 seasons since the last Persona matchup. I believe Weiss versus Mitsuru was season 6 off the top of my head, because I think, yeah, it was season 6. It happened in the same season as Ben Hal, so... Yeah, it's been a long fucking while since Persona got any love on Death Battle. It's very overdue for that to happen. So yeah, I don't really think I need to go much more in-depth on why I think this suits the suit. I didn't even think of that before I said it. But yeah, I'm pretty comfortable putting this one here. I think it's pretty reasonable to expect a JoJo matchup at some point this season. And I think it would be a good opportunity to bring Persona back as well. And I just generally think this matchup is likely to happen, so hopefully this one matches it, because I would really like to see this one happen. Next, we move on to the Pentagram symbol, which is kind of like a 5-point star surrounded by a circle. Not really sure if it's explicitly a pentagram, but it's like the first thing I associate with that sort of symbol, so we're just going to call it that for this. And it makes sense too, because the matchup that I think suits this one the best and would be most likely to happen is most connected to the pentagram out of like any other interpretation, and that is because the matchup that I put for this symbol is Gojo versus Makima. Now, I can't get super in-depth about why I think this one suits this symbol super well, because like I've immersed myself a bit in some Chainsaw Man media. Mainly, I just watched like most of the first season of the anime, dabbled a little bit in the manga just to kind of see how it paralleled those first episodes. And on the flip side, I know fuck all about Jujutsu Kaisen, so I can't say a whole lot about how this relates to Gojo. But that's all fine and dandy, because I don't really think the connection to the pentagram symbol on the Cipher wheel is that deep for either of these two. It really just comes down to, like, their series dealing with, like, demons and, like, those sorts of supernatural enemies from hell spawned from, like, the darker side of human cognition, like between demons and curses in Chainsaw Man and Jujutsu Kaisen respectively. I think it's fairly reasonable to kind of draw that connection between them, even though I don't believe the pentagram symbol itself is really closely tied to either series. If it is, I would imagine it's more connected to Chainsaw Man than the other way around, because like I don't think curses are explicitly like demonic. I think they're more like emotion-based. At least that's what I remember from the Death Battle cast about this matchup. So again, take everything I'm saying with kind of a grain of salt. I'm just kind of approaching this from more of a general angle. Now, I think this one is fairly reasonable to put on the Cipher wheel for this symbol, because, I mean, this is a really good time to do this matchup. Jujutsu Kaisen and Chainsaw Man are probably around the peak of their popularity at the moment. Like, I can't imagine, like, from what I've heard, Jujutsu Kaisen is close to wrapping up. And I don't know how much longer Chainsaw Man's gonna go on for, but I think this is a good time to strike the iron while it's hot for both of these series. And I believe the Death Battle cast for this matchup actually did very reasonably well in terms of views. I believe it hit 6 digits, which is very, well, not very, but fairly impressive compared to like most of the Death Battle casts around it. I'm not super consistent with following Death Battle casts, so that might be subject to like some review from people who watch it more religiously than I do, but yeah, I think Gojo versus Makima is a completely valid pick to put with the pentagram on the Cipher wheel, so I'm going to stick it with that. Now we get to Biffweed's favorite symbol on the Cipher, far and away, the awesome funny Beaker. You'll love to see it. I can't believe we've come to this point already. This one's probably going to be a little on the short and sweet side, since I don't really think I need to elaborate too much on my pick for this slot, since I've already put Stitch vs. Rocket in the star spot, which is really the only matchup I think you could contest for putting in this slot at this point in the season. So yeah, I'm just gonna be that guy and put Bowser vs. Eggman here. Everyone and their fucking mom is expecting this match to happen this season, or at least some point in the very near future. And I think it's fairly likely to happen as well, especially since it matches up with the symbol really nicely. You've got like the beaker to represent Eggman being a scientist, and then there's like the ring of spikes around it to represent Bowser's shell. Yeah, it's really not hard to figure out why so many people, including me, are putting this match here. I do really hope it happens. And with that, we come down to the final symbol that we need to put a match for on this wheel at this point, which is the shuffle arrows. Now, this one threw me off a lot when I first saw the Cipher wheel, and it's still kind of been throwing me for a loop ever since then. I've not really seen a solid consensus of what this could represent, mainly because, like, not many people knew what to make of it. I saw at least a few people throwing around the idea that this was like, oh, it's like reshuffling old material, like people thought that they were going to bring back, like, old characters, or maybe even do, like, a fully fledged rematch, like Master Chief versus Doomslayer, or like something like that, but I don't believe that's what it's going for at this point, unless it is pointing to like a big rematch or something, but I don't really think that's what this is pointing toward. In which case, what do I think it's pointing toward then? Well, after thinking about it and like cross-referencing with some other Cipher predictions that I've seen, like the others that I looked at before going into this video, I found one that I think really strikes a chord with what I interpret this symbol to be, that being the shuffle arrows, and I think that it would be a fairly decent one to do at this point, so I'm gonna go with it, meaning that the last match I'm putting for this Cipher wheel prediction is Ash Ketchum versus Yugi Muto. Now, the way that this fits the shuffle arrows pertains to, like, the team-based or, like, card deck-based battling strategies that both Ash and Yugi would use in a fight. Like, when you're using a card deck in Yu-Gi-Oh!, you shuffle your cards, obviously. Like, that's just part of, like, card game terminology. But you could also interpret the arrows like how they're switching places from top to bottom. Kind of like how in a Pokemon battle you switch out your team members between, like, the party that you have in the back and the Pokemon that's currently active on the field. So it's not super in-depth, but, like, again, like, none of the symbols on this Cipher wheel necessarily have to be, like, super ironclad in terms of, like, their reasoning. So I'm very comfortable going with something like that for this wheel, which makes me fairly confident. Well, saying confident is a bit misleading. Like, I'm not super set on this match happening. Like, I don't know if it really would or could right now, but I think that it's at least somewhat likely in terms of, like, non-Pokemon battles, where it's like a trainer and stuff, which we haven't really gotten since, like, Pokemon versus Digimon, so it would be cool to see something like that come back to the show with a match like this. Like, Yu-Gi-Oh!, I think most people can agree, has been waiting for an episode for quite a long time, so yeah, Ash versus Yugi for the shuffle arrows, that's really about all I have to say about it. I think this is pretty easily the matchup and symbol combination that I'm least confident in out of everything here. At least aside from Saiyans versus the Judge, but you probably could have picked that up from how I was talking about it, so I'd be very interested to hear what other people's thoughts are for the shuffle arrows, and I guess the Scales of Judgment as well, but that's kind of besides the point. But yeah, I'm very interested to see what other people think of this symbol in particular, because even with my prediction for it here, I would be very open to hearing other ideas for what it could represent. And that's going to do it for this mid-season Cipher retrospective and revisiting of the predictions for it. I think I'm pretty happy with all of the matches and where I've put them on this wheel. I would be very happy if this was how the rest of Season 10 turned out. I think this would be a really sick lineup for the Season 2 pull out. So yeah, let me know what you all think of this lineup down in the comments below. I'd be really interested to, like, get the discussion around the Cipher going again, because I think after the season got going after a point, people kind of fell off talking about the Cipher, which kind of let me down, because I think this is a really, really sick way for the Death Battle team to generate discussion and, like, hype around a season that's coming up. And, I mean, I don't really know if they're going to do something like this again, both because people have definitely talked about the Cipher quite a lot, and I can imagine that the team probably got tired of hearing about it at a certain point, and this was also just really fitting to do in a season where we were getting Bill's Cipher, so it might not really be as fitting for future seasons, but I would absolutely be open to the idea of the team doing something like this again in the future, so yeah, hopefully there can be more discussion about what we think the rest of the season will look like based on what we all think is left in the Cipher down in the comments of this video. I would really like to read what your guys' thoughts are, so yeah, thanks for watching this video. I'll see you soon for the next one. Later!